Good evening and welcome back to Catechesis with the Pastors. We are going through G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. It's a fun chapter tonight because it looks at so many criticisms of Christianity historically, uh, but but shows that they actually reveal something great and profound about the Christian faith. Yeah, this is spectacular stuff. If you are joining us for the first time, there is a little icon down in the corner for the Rumble Talk. If you want to send in questions, send in comments as we are going through, feel free to click on that and put your name in, and then you can start sending stuff in. There is a bit of a time delay. That time delay allows for some quality for our video. Just make sure that your slider is all the way over to the side so that delay is minimized as much as possible. And then on the website screen, can we go to that? There is over here, we've got the chapters. If you want to click on chapter 6, and then you'll have the text that I'm looking at with the highlights and whatnot that I've gotten there. You can do that and join us there. I need to apologize. I have not updated that glossary. It only goes through chapter 4. I hope to get on that eventually, especially this chapter we're going through. There's so much name dropping that he does in this chapter. It's a very Chestertonian thing to be doing. So it can be really helpful if we've got a glossary just to help us go through. So I'm going to try and work on that this week, but we will see. Anyways, let's jump right in and let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, you have revealed yourself to us through your Son, Jesus Christ, and given space for all of the good in the world. Strengthen us, that through these reflections we might recognize that good, that we might recognize even the balance of extremes, and through that come to a greater sense of truth and reality in you. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. All right, so we can get into then that text. All right. So Chesterton begins chapter 6, right? The real trouble with this world of ours is not that it's an unreasonable world, or even that it is a reasonable one. The commonest kind of trouble is that it is nearly reasonable, but not quite. Life is not an illogicality, yet it is a trap for logicians. It looks just a little more mathematical and regular than it is. Its exactitude is obvious, but its inexactitude is hidden. Its wildness lies in wait. He goes through and he gives examples using the human body. He talks about he talks about how oranges are round, but really they're not spheres, right? They're not perfect spheres. Going through all of these sort of examples of how things are not. They look like they might fit something that is very exact, and yet they wind up not being very exact, right? We're going to skip down a little bit. I'm going to even skip down. There's so much to cover in this chapter, so we're just going to have to. The moon mathematician, we'll skip that too. We can keep going a little bit. Okay, so it is my only purpose in this chapter to point this out, to show that whenever we feel there is something odd in Christian theology, we shall generally find that there is something odd in the truth. I have, right. So this idea there's aspects of this world that are just, they're strange, they're odd. And we would expect that Christian theology and thought, any good and true philosophical thought, is going to be odd precisely in those places where reality is odd. I think I've mentioned before a little bit when it comes to a cosmology, a sense of the whole of the world and creation, right? A cosmology or philosophy that begins with humanity and tries to make humanity kind of the norm and then understand everything else is going to have problems, because in the cosmos, humanity is this really bizarre thing. We are like this combination of animal and angel. We are this bringing together of the material and the spiritual, and that makes us odd. And so a healthy philosophy and cosmology can reflect really well on the material world, can reflect really well on the angelic world. But then as we come to humanity, it reflects on something that's this odd combination of the two. It's something I think you find really reflected in someone like St. Thomas Aquinas. So a question, why do you think that these oddities and irregularities are in the truth? Was it so Chesterton could have a convenient proof for Christianity? It's not just so that Chesterton can have convenient proof for Christianity. These oddnesses that we find in the world, it's part of a reality that is greater than us. Right? Again, this idea that reality is not going to be something we can simply wrap our minds around and get to fit inside of our brains, right? But there's always going to be this element of mystery, this element of something that's greater than us. And so we're going to find irregularities. We're going to find oddities. Yeah. So, all right. I have alluded to an unmeaning phrase to the effect that such and such a creed cannot be believed in our age. He talked about this in an earlier chapter, right? Of course, anything can be believed in any age. But oddly enough, there really is a sense in which a creed, if it is believed at all, can be believed more fixedly in a complex society than in a simple one. If a man finds Christianity true in Birmingham, he has actually clearer reasons for faith than if he had found it true in Mercia. If you were English, you'd probably know this. Mercia is an old kingdom that was situated in the middle of England. Birmingham is the city that's like in the middle of England. So he's actually talking about the exact same place, but one is an ancient kingdom and one is a modern city. So if something works in the complexity of all of this, the craziness we find ourselves in the modern world, that actually gives it more credence than simply being believed in a much more simple society and situation. For the more complicated seems the coincidence, the less it can be a coincidence. If snowflakes fell in the shape of, say, the heart of Midlothian, it might be an accident. The heart of Midlothian it's a heart-shaped design, but it's almost spherical. It doesn't have a lot of detail. Again, this is a symbol that you might know if you were English. But if snowflakes fell exactly the shape of the maze at Hampton Court, one might call it a miracle. It is exactly as of such a miracle that I have since come to feel the philosophy of Christianity. The complication of our modern world proves the truth of the creed more perfectly than any plain problems of the ages of faith. Right? We scroll down a little bit, right? I think this line gets to what he's the bottom of that paragraph gets to this more exact than anything he said at this point, right? A stick might fit a hole, or a stone a hollow by accident, but a key and a lock are both complex. And if a key fits a lock, you know it's the right key. Right? So the argument that the more complex the problems get, if you find something that works, you really start to think that that's because what works is like a key and a lock, that it has to be itself sufficiently complex, and they really are meant for each other. Whereas if you look at a situation where problems are more simple, than a solution that works, it may be more of an accident or coincidence. But this involved accuracy of the thing makes it very difficult to do what I now have to do, to describe this accumulation of truth. It is very hard for a man to defend anything of which he is entirely convinced. It is comparatively easy when he is only partially convinced. He is partially convinced because he has found this or that proof of the thing, and he can expound it. But a man is not really convinced of a philosophical theory when he finds that something proves it. He is only really convinced when he finds that everything proves it. And the more converging reasons he finds pointing to this conviction, the more bewildered he is if asked suddenly to sum them up. Thus, if one asked an ordinary intelligent man on the spur of the moment, "Why do you prefer civilization to savagery?" he would look wildly round at object after object, and would only be able to answer vaguely, "Why, there's that bookcase, and the coals in the coal scuttle, and pianos, and policemen, and indoor plumbing, and coffee shops, and," right? The whole case for civilization is that the case for it is complex. It has done so many things. But that very multiplicity of proof, which ought to make the reply overwhelming, makes reply impossible. There is therefore about all complete conviction a kind of huge helplessness. The belief is so big that it takes a long time to get it into action. And this hesitation chiefly arises, oddly enough, from an indifference about where one should begin. All roads lead to Rome, which is one reason why many people never get there. In the case of the defense of the Christian conviction, I confess that I would as soon begin the argument with one thing as another. I would begin it with a turnip or with a taximeter cab, right? So Chesterton has given an explication that I think is really important for us to hear. Because so many of us, maybe really steeped in our faith, very faithful practicing Christians, faithful practicing Catholics, may know a good deal of our faith, and yet can find ourselves thrown completely off balance when somebody asks us a question about the faith. Somebody asks us to defend something about the faith. And to suggest that the reason we are thrown off may not be just because of ignorance, right? But maybe because we don't really know where to start, because that's not how our belief works. That's not how our faith works. Our faith isn't based on just something that I know, some set of arguments that have produced it, right? But really, we've begun to be convinced by everything. And so I don't know where to start. It can be a really great thing for us to engage in the sort of branch of theology that we call apologetics, right? Apologetics is a branch of theology that really is about trying to explain and defend the faith to those who are outside of it. It's not the it's not where you want to end in your theology, because there's a lot you're never gonna understand until you really are entering into the faith, right? But this attempt to explain the faith to those outside, this branch of apologetics, and it can be really good for us to engage in that, to study that, so that when people ask us questions, we've got something, right? We have something that we're ready to go. Of course, it's also extraordinarily helpful that when people ask us questions, we ask them questions back. And we sort of try and walk with them and try to understand what it is they're actually talking about, where it is they actually stand. You can't, just because somebody calls themselves an atheist doesn't mean you actually know what that means until you've talked with them. And you've found out, no, actually, they do believe in God. They're just really angry at him, right? Or you find out that it's more that they just don't care and think they're fine without him, right? Or they think that the belief in God has been one of the worst things that could happen to humanity, right? All kinds of different responses that all might use the term atheist. But to be able to sit with them and listen, and through that come to discern what might be that best path that we can take in order to explain, in order to help them see that there might be something different. Maybe one of those paths is handing them Orthodoxy and encouraging them to read it. So, Chesterton there goes on, and he says that it was not by reading apologetics that he came to understand the Christian faith, right? It was through reading the atheists. It was through reading all of those who were attacking Christianity that he came to this understanding and this faith in Christianity. So if we scroll down a good bit, it was Huxley and Herbert Spencer and Bradlaugh who brought me back to Orthodox theology. They sowed in my mind the first wild doubts of doubt, right? These are great skeptics, great writers of skepticism, right? But their writings cause him to start to doubt skepticism, to doubt the doubt. We scroll down to the next one. For not only, as I understood, had Christianity the most flaming vices, but it had apparently a mystical talent for combining vices which seemed inconsistent with each other. It was attacked on all sides for all contradictory reasons. Right? So as he's reading these atheists, as he's engaging in these skeptics, and they're attacking Christianity, he's finding them attacking for like opposite reasons. And it's like Christianity seems to have this ability to combine vices that doesn't seem like you should be able to combine. No sooner had one rationalist demonstrated that it went too far to the east than another demonstrated with equal clearness that it is much too far from the west. It's a little poetical and not getting into much. So he's going to give us some examples of these contradictions that made their arguments fall apart. He suggests that he's going to give 4 or 5 of them. He's going to give 9, and then he's going to give an overarching 10th. But he wants to he doesn't want to tell us how much he's going to give us, right? So he wants us to keep reading. There are 50 more. Thus, for instance, I was much moved by the eloquent attack on Christianity as a thing of inhuman gloom. For I thought and still think sincere pessimism an unpardonable sin. Insincere pessimism is a social accomplishment, rather agreeable than otherwise. And fortunately, nearly all pessimism is insincere. That is the pessimism that he has a problem with takes itself way too seriously, right? It actually comes out of a hatred for the reality around us. Whereas the insincere pessimism that we find mostly, maybe not so much. Looks like we've got a question. Yeah. So how does the sincere versus insincere pessimism understood, right? So that's what he means by sincere pessimism is really coming out of this hatred of the world and reality and everything around it, right? Where the insincere pessimism is probably more coming out of our just disappointment with all of the things that we encounter in this world. But the suggestion from the atheists is that Christianity is this sort of sincere pessimism, right? But if Christianity was, as these people said, a thing purely pessimistic and opposed to life, then I was quite prepared to blow up St. Paul's Cathedral. But the extraordinary thing is this. They did prove to me in chapter 1, to my complete satisfaction, that Christianity was too pessimistic. And then in chapter 2, they began to prove to me that it was a great deal too optimistic. One accusation against Christianity was that it prevented men by morbid tears and terrors from seeking joy and liberty in the bosom of nature. But another accusation was that it comforted men with a fictitious providence and put them in a pink and white nursery. One great agnostic asked why nature was not beautiful enough and why it was hard to be free. Another great agnostic objected that Christian optimism, the garment of make-believe woven by pious hands, hid from us the fact that nature was ugly and that it was impossible to be free. Right, so this double sort of attack on Christianity, right? That on the one hand, it was disparaging of the natural realm and of us doing whatever we wanted to do. And on the other hand, it seemed to have all of these promises of providence, of this loving God, but that was just to cover up the fact that reality was so horrible. So it's the accusations that Christianity is trying to make us think that the world is horrible, and Christianity is trying to make us think that there really is tremendous blessing in the world. One rationalist had hardly done calling Christianity a nightmare before another began to call it a fool's paradise. This puzzled me. The charges seemed inconsistent. Christianity could not at once be the black mask on a white world and also the white mask on a black world. The state of the Christian could not be at once so comfortable that he was a coward to cling to it, and so uncomfortable that he was a fool to stand it. If it falsified human vision, it must falsify it in one way or another. It could not wear both green and rose-colored spectacles. Right. Scroll down a little bit. Goes through talking a little bit about poetry of Swinburne. And I thought, no, we can go down there. I thought there must be something wrong. And I did for one wild moment cross my mind that perhaps those might not be the very best judges of the relation of religion to happiness, who, by their own account, had neither one nor the other. It must be understood that I did not conclude hastily that the accusations were false or that the accusers fools. I simply deduced that Christianity must be something even weirder and wickeder than they made out. A thing might have these two opposite vices, but it must be a rather queer thing if it did. A man might be too fat in one place and too thin in another, but then he would be an odd shape. At this point, my thoughts were only of the odd shape of the Christian religion. I did not allege any odd shape in the rationalistic mind. Here is another case of the same kind. I felt that a strong case against Christianity lay in the charge that there was something timid, monkish, and unmanly about all that is called Christian, especially in its attitude towards resistance and fighting. The great skeptics of the 19th century were largely virile. Bradley in an expansive way, Huxley in a reticent way, were decidedly men. In comparison, it seemed tenable that there was something weak and over-patient about Christian councils. The gospel paradox about the other cheek, the fact that priests never fought, 100 things made plausible the accusation that Christianity was an attempt to make a man too like a sheep. I read it and believed it. And if I had read nothing different, I should have gone on believing it. But I read something very different. I turned to the next page in my agnostic manual, and my brain turned upside down. Now I found that I was to hate Christianity not for fighting too little, but for fighting too much. Christianity, it seemed, was the mother of wars. Christianity had deluged the world with blood. I got thoroughly angry with the Christian because he was never angry. Now I was told to be angry with him because his anger had been the most huge and horrible thing in human history. Because his anger had soaked the earth and smoked to the sun. Very people who reproached Christianity with the meekness and non-resistance of the monasteries were the very people who reproached it with the violence and valor of the Crusades. Right? So we've talked about Christianity being too pessimistic and too optimistic about the reality we live in, about it being too weak and timid, but also the source of all wars. Right? Let me scroll down a little bit. What could it all mean? What was this Christianity, which always forbade war and always produced wars? What could be the nature of the thing, which one could abuse first because it would not fight, and second because it was always fighting? In what world of riddles was born this monstrous murderer and this monstrous meekness? The shape of Christianity grew a queerer shape every instant. Let's look at the third case, and then if we want to stop and ask any questions, we can do that. I take the third case, the strangest of all, because it involves the one real objection to the faith. The one real objection to the Christian religion is simply that it is one religion. The world is a big place full of very different kinds of people. Christianity, it may reasonably be said, is one thing confined to one kind of people. It began in Palestine. It has practically stopped with Europe. I was duly impressed with this argument in my youth. I was much drawn towards the doctrine often preached in ethical societies. I mean, the doctrine that there is one great unconscious church of all humanity founded on the omnipresence of the human conscience. Creeds, it was said, divided men, but at least morals united them. Right? So the problem with Christianity, it seems, is that it's too small and too limiting, that it doesn't recognize the diversity of every place and time. But the thing that is uniting, the thing that is going to hold us together, right, is morality, right? The basic understanding of morality. The soul might seek the strangest and most remote lands and ages and still find essential ethical common sense. It might find Confucius under Eastern trees, and he would be writing, "Thou shalt not steal." It might decipher the darkest hieroglyphic on the most primeval desert, and the meaning when deciphered would be, "Little boys should tell the truth." I believed this doctrine of the brotherhood of all men in the possession of a moral sense, and I believe it still, with other things. And I was thoroughly annoyed with Christianity for suggesting, as I supposed, that whole ages and empires of men had utterly escaped this light of justice and reason. But then I found an astonishing thing. I found that the very people who had said that mankind was one church, from Plato to Emerson, were the very people who said that morality had changed altogether, and that what was right in one age was wrong in another. If I asked, say, for an altar, I was told we needed none. For men, our brothers gave us clear oracles and one creed and their universal customs and ideals. But if I mildly pointed out that one of men's universal customs was to have an altar, then my agnostic teacher turned clean round and told me that men had always been in darkness and superstitions of savages. Right? So, on the one hand, it's morality that's going to unite us, not religion. But morality changes, and it's what was in the past doesn't work for us anymore, right? So Christianity gets attacked, right, on both charges. Any questions with those three examples? Got like 7 more to go. We scroll down a bit. A great little quote from him. This began to be alarming. It looked not so much as if Christianity was bad enough to include any vices, but rather as if any stick was good enough to beat Christianity. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're attacking Christianity with. It seems it's good enough. You can attack it with anything. So then he goes on to explain that he doesn't have any more space to discuss this in detail, and then continues to discuss it in detail. So more contradictions from Christianity, right? It forced women into cloisters and away from their homes and children, but at the same time, it doomed women to the drudgery of homes and children and didn't let them have any quiet contemplation. Christianity was accused of showing contempt for women's intellect, right? But then also sneered at because only women went to church, right? Christianity was too poor, relishing in sackcloth and dried peas. It was too plain, but at the same time, it had way too much pomp and ritual. It was way too colorful, right? It restrained sexuality too much, and Christians also had way too many children. It was not united. Christians had differing ideas, and they didn't have this union. But then it was too united on ideas because variety and diversity is the spice of life, or something like that, right? finally, he notes, right, that Christians were accused of despising Jews, and in the same breath accused of being too Jewish. Again, this goes back to certain debates and concerns that are popular in his time that are going to come to a head, right, in a couple of decades, in really horrific ways. But still, right, being talked about in the context of his time, right? So, lots of other examples that he gives. I wished to be quite fair then, and I wish to be quite fair now. And I did not conclude that the attack on Christianity was all wrong. I only concluded that if Christianity was wrong, it was very wrong indeed. Such hostile horrors might be combined in one thing, but that thing must be very strange and solitary. There are men who are misers and also spendthrifts, but they are rare. There are men sensual and also ascetic, but they are rare. If this mass of mad contradictions really existed, Quakerish, the Quakers, right, that branch of very, very peaceful Christianity, right, Quakerish and bloodthirsty, too gorgeous and too threadbare, austere, yet pandering preposterously to the lust of the eyes, the enemy of women and their foolish refuge, the solemn pessimist and the silly optimist. If this evil existed, then there was in this evil something quite supreme and unique. For I found in my rationalist teachers no explanation of sex exceptional corruption. Christianity, theoretically speaking, was in their eyes only one of the ordinary myths and errors of mortals. They gave me no key to this twisted and unnatural badness. Right? So he's suggesting, I think this is a 10th example, right? If really all of these things are true, then Christianity is this absolute horror, right? But we also accuse it of just being another one of those ordinary myths and confusions from the Dark Ages, right? There's a tremendous imbalance. There's something not right there as well, right? Such a paradox of evil rose to the stature of the supernatural. It was indeed almost as supernatural as the infallibility of the Pope. An historic institution which never went right is really quite as much of a miracle as an institution that cannot go wrong. The only explanation which immediately occurred to my mind was that Christianity did not come from heaven, but from hell. Really, if Jesus of Nazareth was not the Christ, he must have been the Antichrist. And then in a quiet hour, a strange thought struck me like a still thunderbolt. There had suddenly come into my mind another explanation. Suppose we heard an unknown man spoken of by many men. Suppose we were puzzled to hear that some men said he was too tall and some too short. Some objected to his fatness, some lamented his leanness. Some thought him too dark and some too fair. One explanation, as has already been admitted, would be that he might be an odd shape. But there's another explanation. He might be the right shape. Outrageously tall men might feel him to be short. Very short men might feel him to be tall. Old bucks who are growing stout might consider him insufficiently filled out. That's Chesterton describing himself. Old beaux who were growing thin might feel that he expanded beyond the narrow lines of elegance. Perhaps Swedes, who have pale hair in tow, called him a dark man, while Negroes considered him distinctly blonde. Perhaps, in short, this extraordinary thing is really the ordinary thing. At least the normal thing, the center. Perhaps, after all, it is Christianity that is sane, and its critics that are mad. in various ways. And he goes through and talks about reflecting. Oh, some of these are too good to pass up. I was startled to find that this key fitted a lock. For instance, it was certainly odd that the modern world charged Christianity at once with bodily austerity and with artistic pomp. But then it was also odd, very odd, that the modern world itself combined extreme bodily luxury with an extreme absence of artistic pomp. The modern world thought Becket's robes too rich and his meals too poor, right? St. Thomas Becket, the martyred bishop in England, his robes too rich and his meals too poor. But then the modern man was really exceptional in history. No man before ever ate such elaborate dinners in such ugly clothes. The modern man found the church too simple, exactly where modern life is too complex. He found the church too gorgeous, exactly where modern life is too dingy. The man who disliked the plain fasts and feasts was mad on entrees. The man who disliked vestments wore a pair of preposterous trousers. And surely if there was any insanity involved in the matter, it was in the trousers, not in the simply falling robe. If there was any insanity at all, it was in the extravagant entrees, not in the bread and wine. I went over all the cases, and the key fitted so far. And he goes into some more examples, right? We can skip over Swinburne and the Malthusians. The Malthusians are those who are thinking that the population is too big, and so the answer is that we have to stop having children. Nevertheless, it could not, I felt, be quite true that Christianity was merely sensible and stood in the middle. There was really an element in it of emphasis and even frenzy, which had justified the secularists in their superficial criticism. It might be wise, I began more and more to think. It might be wise. I began more and more to think that it was wise, but it was not merely worldly wise. It was not merely temperate and respectable. Its fierce crusaders and meek saints might balance each other. Still, the crusaders were very fierce, and the saints were very meek, meek beyond all decency. Now, it was just at this point of speculation that I remembered my thoughts about the martyr and the suicide. In that matter, it had been this combination between two almost insane positions, which had somehow amounted to sanity. It was just such another contradiction, and this I had already found to be true. This was exactly one of the paradoxes in which skeptics found the creed wrong, and in this I had found it right. So he his conclusion winds up being, right, that odd things are odd to odd people, right? Normal things are odd to odd people, and the modern world is very, very, very odd. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the modern world takes up all kinds of issues with something that is actually very sane, something that is actually very, very fitting to the world. Because modern man doesn't really fit in the world and is rather inhumane in all kinds of different ways. Right? But he comes to recognize, right, that the ideas of Christianity aren't pointing to this mediocre middle, right? It's not pointing to this mediocre middle, but rather this balance of extremes. And he's going to go through a number of examples of this balance of the extremes that he finds in Christianity. Right? So we remember last week as he was talking about, right, the suicide and the martyr, which on some level look to be such similar acts, right? But that there could be this extreme hatred for one and this extreme love and reverence for the other, right? It wasn't that one had gone just far enough and the other had gone too far, right? But rather that they were sort of these polar opposites. Right. The idea was that which I had outlined, touching the optimist and the pessimist. We want not an amalgam or compromise, but both things at the top of their energy. Love and wrath, both burning. Right? And he talked about, right, the ability to love something enough to tear it down and make it to what it was supposed to be, right? Here I will only trace it in relation to ethics. But I need not remind the reader that the idea of this combination is indeed central in Orthodox theology. For Orthodox theology has specially insisted that Christ is not a being apart from God and man like an elf. Like in theology, we call this like nor yet half human and half not, like a centaur. In theology, we call this the tertium quid, like a third thing. And this is a heretical problem that comes up in the history of theology, where some wanted to talk about Christ as God and man as being this sort of blending of the two, and this sort of like third thing. But theology has always said no, he's not, right? But both things at once and both things thoroughly, very man and very God. Okay. So, but he's going to trace it through more ethical things rather than looking at Christian theology itself. Right? He brings in this Greek term mason, which we would often translate as moderation, right? Especially when you're talking about Aristotle and his ethics. There's a lot of talk about moderation. And so he's looking back to paganism and to Aristotle, right? Especially in his ethics, about this need for moderation, that virtue was in the middle, in the moderation, right? Between two vices. But what he wants to get at is this question of how is that balance achieved, right? How is that moderation met? Is that balance achieved through coming to this sort of mediocre middle, or is that balance achieved by holding both extremes simultaneously? So we go down a little bit. Paganism declared that virtue was in a balance. Christianity declared it was in a conflict, the collision of two passions apparently opposite. Of course, they were not really inconsistent, but they were such that it was hard to hold simultaneously. Let us follow for a moment the clue of the martyr and the suicide, and take the case of courage. No quality has ever so much addled the brains and tangled the definitions of merely rational sages. Courage is almost a contradiction of terms. And as a contradiction of terms, right, it's a kind of paradox. And these are the things that Chesterton loves to talk about the most, right? Courage means a strong desire to live, taking the form of a readiness to die. He that will lose his life, the same shall save it, is not a piece of mysticism for saints and heroes. It was a piece of everyday advice for sailors or mountaineers. It might be printed on an alpine guide or a drill book. paradox is the whole principle of courage, even of quite earthly or quite brutal courage. If any of you have read some of those articles from Chesterton that I've also posted on the site, one of those articles, 12 Men, he also goes into a very similar discussion of courage, and it's equally fun as with some of this. Right? But recognizing that in a dangerous situation, if you want to save your life, you gotta risk it, right? There has to be that move, right? That risks it precisely because you love your life. Right? So if we go down a bit, that should be good. No philosopher, I fancy, has ever expressed this romantic riddle with adequate lucidity, and I certainly have not done so. But Christianity has done more. It has marked the limits of it in the awful graves of the suicide and the hero, showing the distance between him who dies for the sake of living and him who dies for the sake of dying. And it has held up ever since above the European lances the banner of the mystery of chivalry, the Christian courage, which is a disdain for death, not the Chinese courage, which is a disdain for life. One of the things that's going on in Chesterton's time is this it's a fad to be importing Eastern thought, often not being imported all that critically, and often being embraced and jumped upon just because it's different from the traditional Christian thought of Europe. So you see those references to the East made quite frequently. Got a question there. I know we still do talk about virtues as a balance between extremes rather than a combination or coexistence of extremes. Are both ways of thinking about it equally valid, or are there some virtues for which an in-between works better than a both and? One of the things that gets distorted when we start talking about virtue often is that we think that this moderation, that it is this sort of mediocre middle, right? And he's going to go more into this, but like with regard to eating, right? With regard to food, that if I'm moderate in my eating, that means I'm always having a very reasonable amount of food. I'm not having too little, and I'm not having too much, right? What Chesterton is going to suggest, and what I think he's right, Christianity does suggest, is that no, moderation is found in fasting and feasting. Moderation is really found in knowing when it is appropriate to be fasting and when it is appropriate to be feasting. And that there can be, you can do some really tremendous fasting and you can do some really tremendous feasting. And there are going to be limits, right? But there's a goodness to both. And that goodness is not going to be lost, right? Both are going to be held, this kind of balance of both extremes. There are times when you should not, when you should be very frugal with what you are spending and how you are spending. There are times when you should be extravagant in how you are spending, right? Yeah. So I think he is going to want to argue, and I think a healthy sense of virtue ethics is also going to be arguing, right? That it's not that there is a point that we have to get to and stay there, right? But that there is a time and a place for each side. And we need to know that time in that place. And Aristotle would express it as that sense of, what is the right amount to be eating now? He's not imagining that there's one proper amount that you are eating at every meal, right? But that at Thanksgiving, you are going to be eating differently than you are on a Friday during Lent, right? That would be a very, what is the mean? What is the moderation or something would depend on the situation, right? And that gets expanded to this balancing of both extremes. I'm sure there are cases where we would have to think about the language we want to use in order to talk about it that way. But yeah, I think we can work that out. And now I began to find that this duplex passion was the Christian key to ethics everywhere, right? Just as in things, you're going to find it everywhere. Everywhere, the creed made a moderation out of the still crash of two impetuous emotions. Take, for instance, the matter of modesty. So he's gone through courage. Now he's going to talk about modesty. Just a reminder, our culture and Christian culture is very confused about what modesty is. Modesty is what Chesterton is talking about here. It has something to do with pride and humility. It's there's an area of modesty that's concerned about my looks and whether I am if you've got it, flaunt it, or like something like that, right? Or modest is hottest, but modesty is really about this pride and humility. We try and associate it with lust, and the moment you start to do that, like, you've really confused what the whole idea is anyways, and it just leads to problems. We need to get back to, it's about pride and humility. And this is what Chesterton is talking about. Right? So take, for instance, the matter of modesty, the balance between mere pride and mere prostration. The average pagan, like the average agnostic, would merely say that he was content with himself, but not insolently self-satisfied. That there were many better and many worse, that his deserts were limited, but he would see that he got them. In short, he would walk with his head in the air, but not necessarily with his nose in the air. This is a manly and rational position. But it is open to the objection we noted against the compromise between optimism and pessimism, the resignation of Matthew Arnold. You'd have to know more of Matthew Arnold's philosophy to get a sense, but Chesterton is definitely accusing him of the mediocre middle, right? Being a mixture of two things, it is a dilution of two things. Neither is present in its full strength, nor contributes its full color. This proper pride does not lift the heart like the tongue of trumpets. You cannot go clad in crimson and gold for this. On the other hand, this mild rationalist modesty does not cleanse the soul with fire and make it clear like crystal. It does not, like a strict and searching humility, make a man as a little child who can sit at the feet of the grass. It does not make him look up and see marvels, for Alice must grow small if she is to be Alice in Wonderland. Thus it loses both the poetry of being proud and the poetry of being humble. Christianity sought by this same strange expedient to save both of them. It separated the two ideas and then exaggerated them both. In one way, man was to be haughtier than he had ever been before. In another way, he was to be humbler than he had ever been before. Right? Insofar as I am a man, I am the chief of creatures. Insofar as I am a man, I am the chief of sinners. All humility that had meant pessimism, that had meant man taking a vague or mean view of his whole destiny, all of that was to go away. We were to hear no more the wail of Ecclesiastes that humanity had no preeminence over the brute, or the awful cry of Homer that man was only the saddest of all the beasts of the field. Man was a statue of God walking about the garden. Man had preeminence over all the brutes. Man was only sad because he was not a beast, but a broken God. The Greek had spoken of men creeping on the earth as if clinging to it. Now man was to tread on the earth as if to subdue it. Christianity thus held a thought of the dignity of man that could only be expressed in crowns rayed like the sun and fans of peacock plumage. Yet at the same time, it could hold a thought about the abject smallness of man that could only be expressed in fasting and fantastic submission, in the gray ashes of St. Dominic and the white snows of St. Bernard. When one came to think of one's self, there was a vista and void enough for any amount of bleak abnegation and bitter truth. There, the realistic gentleman could let himself go as long as he let himself go at himself. There was an open playground for the happy pessimist. Let him say anything against himself short of blaspheming the original aim of his being. Let he call himself a fool and even a damned fool, though that is Calvinistic. But he must not say that fools are not worth saving. He must not say that a man qua man can be valueless. Here again, in short, Christianity got over the difficulty of combining furious opposites by keeping them both furious. The church was positive on both points. One can hardly think too little of oneself. One can hardly think too much of one's soul. Right? And so this exaltation of what it means to be a human being, but also this recognition of just how little and nothing we are before God. Yeah, someone's asking about the gray ashes of St. Dominic. I don't know what that's quite referring to. Yeah, I'm really not quite sure what that's referring to. Yeah, if anyone comes up with that, I would be very, very interested to know. Mr. Pat is currently typing something. He's probably typing something along the lines of Father Dominic David doesn't know the answer to a question. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what he's referring to with that. Unless it's a reference to the burning of heretical books. I usually think of St. Francis as the one who's known for putting ashes on his food so it didn't taste too good. So that's a great question. Maybe somebody's got an answer there for us, or another question. Yeah, somebody else was saying they couldn't figure that one out either. Yeah, great question. This is the kind of stuff I usually try, that I tried to look up when I was doing those first 4 chapters of the glossary. I haven't had time to do that for these chapters. So, all right. So then he's got a third case, a third example, charity. Right? Take another case, the complicated question of charity, which some highly uncharitable idealists seem to think quite easy. Christianity is a paradox like charity is a paradox like modesty and courage. Stated baldly, charity certainly means one of two things: pardoning unpardonable acts or loving unlovable people. Right? So he doesn't quite mean charity in the theological sense, but certainly the kinds of things that seem to result from charity in the theological sense. But if we ask ourselves, as we did in the case of pride, what a sensible pagan would feel about such a subject, we shall probably be beginning at the bottom of it. A sensible pagan would say that there were some people one could forgive and some one couldn't. A slave who stole wine could be laughed at. A slave who betrayed his benefactor could be killed, and cursed even after he was killed. Insofar as the act was pardonable, a man was pardonable. That again is rational and even refreshing, but it is a dilution. It leaves no place for a pure horror of injustice, such as that which is a great beauty in the innocent. And it leaves no place for a mere tenderness for men as men, for such is the whole fascination of the charitable. Christianity came in here as before. It came in startlingly with a sword and clove one thing from another. It divided the crime from the criminal. The criminal we must forgive unto 70 times 7. The crime we must not forgive at all. Right? So this by the crime we must not forgive at all, right? What he means is that sin as such, right, is evil. All of it is evil. Yes, there are degrees of sin, right? But all of it is evil. And you can't just acquiesce to it. You can't just say, oh, that's just a silliness, right? Of somebody who's pathetic or something like that, right? It's all of it really is evil, right? And yet that tremendous that need to forgive the criminal. It was not enough that slaves who stole wine inspired partly anger and partly kindness. We must be much more angry with the theft than before, and yet much kinder to thieves than before. There was room for wrath and love to run wild. And the more I considered Christianity, the more I found that while it had established a rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild. Skip down. More references that we could easily spend time discussing and getting lost in. St. Francis, here's one that we might recognize, right? St. Francis, in praising all good, could be a more shouting optimist than Walt Whitman. St. Jerome, in denouncing all evil, could paint the world blacker than Schopenhauer. Both passions were free because both were kept in their place. Right. This is actually one of the profound and beautiful things in the church that we find in the saints, right? That the saints are able to be examples of tremendous qualities that might seem opposed to each other, and yet we often find in the saints really all of the virtues, and we find in the church saints that are so diverse in the gifts and in the way that God has drawn them and made use of them. Go down to the next. Oh, we got a question there. It seems like St. Jerome is the go-to example for pessimistic saints. Is there any other notable pessimistic saints? That's a great question. St. Jerome, right? So St. Jerome's writings, he sounds like a curmudgeon. and especially when he's writing against people who are speaking against the faith. But even when he's writing to St. Augustine, he sounds like a bit of a curmudgeon. But let's see, gosh, are there any others? Are there any others I can think of? Don't know that any come to mind. Though there's certainly saints that have a tremendous fierceness about them in their writings. Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe somebody else can think of another saint. But yeah, we do usually use Saint Jerome as our go-to. Right. Go down to the next section. Thus, the double charges of the secularists, though throwing nothing but darkness and confusion on themselves, throw real light on the faith. Right. So that the fact that the secularists, the atheists, the agnostics, would throw these sort of double charges at Christianity, right, attacking it from two sort of opposite sides, it wound up showing just how confused they were themselves, but actually help for Chesterton at least to recognize the real light of the faith. It is true that the historic church has at once emphasized celibacy and emphasized the family. Has at once, if I may put it so, been fiercely for having children and fiercely for not having children. It has kept them side by side like two strong colors, red and white. Like the red and white upon the shield of St. George, it has always had a healthy hatred of pink. It's a favorite quote for a lot of people, right? Of course, Chesterton is not speaking against pink. He's speaking about the blending, right, of things, the dilution of things. And St. George's shield, right, of course, this is part of the flags that you find throughout Great Britain. It's that white background with the red cross going through it. It hates the combination of two colors, which is the feeble expedient of the philosophers. It hates the evolution of black into white, which is tantamount to a dirty gray. In fact, the whole theory of the church on virginity might be symbolized by the statement that white is a color, not merely the absence of a color. All that I am urging here can be expressed by saying that Christianity sought, in most of these cases, to keep two colors coexistent but pure. It is not a mixture like russet or purple. It is rather like a shot silk, for a shot silk is always at right angles, and it is the pattern of the cross. I've got a lot of questions popping up. Fulton Sheen is riveting because he seems to have both of these ready during his talks. You know, I would not be surprised to find out that Fulton Sheen was an avid reader of Chesterton. Just that ability to present and that power of rhetoric. Yeah, very much. Is that why we always call it rose? That's in reference to the rose vestments we wear that one weekend in Advent and that one weekend in Lent. We call it rose because of a healthy hatred of pink. No, we call it rose probably for two reasons. One, because in Italian there's no word for pink. It just is rose. English is one of those rare languages that actually has a distinct word for a light red. without referencing to something that you find in the natural world, right? Which is interesting. Curiously, right, we don't have a distinct word for a light blue. We just call it light blue, right? I think Russian does have a distinct word. There's a different word for light blue than for blue. Anyways, colors are a fascinating part of language. No, so it is though arguable that there is a distinct color of Roman rose that is a good bit deeper and more reddish than some of the pink you find in sacristies, including our own. But in any case. So it is also, of course, with the contradictory charges of the anti-Christians about submission and slaughter. It is true that the church told some men, sometimes, sometimes I lose my place. It is true that the church told some men to fight and others not to fight. And it is true that those who fought were like thunderbolts, and those who did not fight were like statues. Right, and he's going into the pacifism of Tolstoy, the Superman. Of course, the comic Superman has not been written yet, right, at all. But there is this German concept of the Übermann that is coming from Nietzsche. So he's actually comparing sort of a Nietzschean to a Tolstoyan approach, right? Right, and again, just the emphasis, right, that these two aspects can exist side by side with each other, that they can be maintained with each other, and we can have monastics. We can also have Saint Joan of Arc, right? Down. And sometimes this pure gentleness and this pure fierceness met and justified their juncture. The paradox of all the prophets was fulfilled, and in the soul of St. Louis, the lion lay down with the lamb. Right? So we can have saints on both extremes. We could also have saints in which both extremes were present at the same time. But remember that this text about the lion lying down with the lamb is too lightly interpreted. It is constantly assured, especially in our Tolstoyan tendencies, the pacifism, right? That when the lion lies down with the lion becomes lamb-like. But that is a brutal annexation and imperialism on the part of the lamb. That is simply the lamb absorbing the lion instead of the lion eating the lamb. The real problem is, can the lion lie down with the lamb and still retain his royal ferocity? That is the problem the church attempted. That is the miracle that she achieved. Right? This is one of my favorite images coming from Chesterton. The lion lying down with the lamb without the lion losing one bit of his ferocity. Right? And being very much against the imperialism of the lamb, right? This fantastic image, right, where we recognize these two great and tremendous goods, right, and the capacity to bring them together, that we find in the church, and that the church has been striving for and struggling for throughout all of history. And he waxes on eloquently but we don't have all the time in the world. Okay, so anyone might say neither swagger nor grovel, and it would have been a limit. But to say, here you can swagger, and here you can grovel, it was an emancipation, right? To truly let the good run wild. This was the big fact of our Christian ethics, the discovery of the new balance. Paganism had been like a pillar of marble, upright, because proportioned with symmetry. Christianity was like a huge and ragged and romantic rock, which, though it sways on its pedestal at a touch, yet because it's exaggerated and excrescences exactly balance each other, is enthroned there for 1,000 years. In a Gothic cathedral, the columns were all different, but they were all necessary. Every support seemed an accidental and fantastic support. Every buttress was a flying buttress. So in Christendom, apparent accidents balanced. Becket, and again, this is a reference to St. Thomas Becket, right, who is this bishop martyr, right? Becket wore a hair shirt under his golden crimson, and there's much to be said for the combination. For Becket got the benefit of the hair shirt, while the people in the street got the benefit of the crimson and gold. It is at least better than the manner of the modern millionaire, who has the black and drab outwardly for others and gold next to his heart. It's the image of the pocket watch, right, that he's got next to his heart. But the balance was not always in one man's body as in Becket's. The balance was often distributed over the whole body of Christendom. Because a man prayed and fasted on the northern snows, flowers could be flung at his festival in the southern cities. And because fanatics drank water on the sands of Syria, men could still drink cider in the orchards of England. What's that? We'll skip this section, and hopefully then we can just a little more. Okay. I will just say, going back to that example of Becket, and I think this is something that made a significant impression on me through Chesterton, right? Because we still have these criticisms of the church, right? That the our contemporary society really does like to criticize the church as having too much pomp, too much color, being too wealthy, being too extravagant, right? But there is a good in the beauty of the church. There's a good in the beauty of vestments, in the beauty of the vessels, right? There is something we draw from. There is a benefit to that beauty, to having that extravagance in the right place, right? And having the poverty in the right place. And the thing that is off, the thing that is odd, I think about our contemporary world is that we want the church to be very simple, and we want the church to be not grandiose or ostentatious in any way, shape, or form, right? Not because of the goodness of simplicity, which is itself a tremendous goodness, right? But because if we can shrink it down like that, then it doesn't have to have such an influence in my life. And I think there's a lot of vice in our world, a lot of people in our world who want the church to be small and want it to be less visible, right? In the name of simplicity, right? But really it's about it being less important. And to be able to have that extravagance and that beauty precisely in the things that are important, and making it absolutely clear where that importance lies, is something we have to keep in that balance. Okay, last and most important, it is exactly this which explains what is so inexplicable to all the modern critics of the history of Christianity. I mean the monstrous wars about small points of theology, the earthquakes of an emotion about a gesture or a word. It was only a matter of an inch, but an inch is everything when you are balancing. The church could not afford to swerve a hair's breadth on some things if she was to continue her great and daring experiment of the irregular equilibrium. Once let one idea become less powerful and some other idea would become too powerful. It was no flock of sheep the Christian shepherd was leading, but a herd of bulls and tigers, of terrible ideals and devouring doctrines, each one of them strong enough to turn to a false religion and lay waste the world. Remember that the church went in specifically for dangerous ideas. She was a lion tamer. The idea of birth through the Holy Spirit, of the death of a divine being, of the forgiveness of sins or the fulfillment of prophecies are ideas which anyone can see need but a touch to turn them into something blasphemous or ferocious. The smallest link was let drop by the artificers of the Mediterranean, and the lion of ancestral pessimism burst his chains in the forgotten forests of the north. On these theological equalizations, I have to speak afterwards. Here it is enough to notice that if some small mistake were made in doctrine, huge blunders might be made in human happiness. Some of you might have heard something like that in a homily recently. A sentence phrased wrong about the nature of symbolism would have broken all the best statues in Europe. A slip in the definitions might stop all the dances, might wither all the Christmas trees or break all the Easter eggs. Doctrines had to be defined within strict limits, even in order that man might enjoy general human liberties. The church had to be careful, if only that the world might be careless. And this is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. This captures, I think, that love and that pursuit of truth, right? And the recognition, that constant need to be balancing. It captures in a beautiful and a tremendously romantic way that old scholastic adage, right? Seldom affirm, never deny, make a distinction, right? That we are right, because in that just straight affirming and denying, you can so easily throw the entire thing off, right? But in this making of distinctions, in this carefully keeping everything balanced, right? We have the profound and the tremendous good that the church has been, that it has introduced us to. And we see throughout the history of the church times when it has swerved, right? When things have gotten out of balance. And we can look to other times in the history of the church to help us restore that balance and to recognize that things can get a little out of whack if we diminish something and something else comes and starts to take its place. This is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy, rather than to be something that we panic over, something that we are really scared about, depressed about, that nothing in the church seems to be going right. Rather, this is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. To see these extremes and to strive to keep them in balance. People have fallen into the foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something heavy, humdrum, and safe. There never was anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy. It was sanity, and to be sane is more dramatic than to be mad. It was the equilibrium of a man behind madly rushing horses, seeming to stoop this way and to sway that, yet in every attitude having the grace of statuary and the accuracy of arithmetic. The church in its early days went fierce and fast with any war horse. Yet it is utterly unhistoric to say that she merely went mad along one idea, like a vulgar fanaticism. She swerved to the left and right so as exactly to avoid enormous obstacles. She left on one hand the huge bulk of Arianism buttressed by all the worldly powers to make Christianity too worldly. Arianism is a heresy. This is a heresy that denied the divinity of Christ, right? And there was actually a point where more bishops were Arian than Orthodox, right? Christianity really almost did collapse under Arianism, and it was what was promoted by the powers of the world. It did have this sort of majority going on for it, and things almost collapsed. And in fact, they probably should have if this was a merely human institution. The next instant, she was swerving to avoid an Orientalism that would have made it too unworldly. The Orthodox Church never took the tame course or accepted the conventions. The Orthodox Church was never respectable. It would have been easier to have accepted the earthly power of the Arians. It would have been easy in the Calvinistic 17th century to fall into the bottomless pit of predestination. It is easy to be a madman. It is easy to be a heretic. It is always easy to let the age have its head. The difficult thing is to keep one's own. It is always easy to be a modernist, as it is easy to be a snob. To have fallen into any of those open traps, the error and exaggeration which fashion after fashion and sect after sect set along the historic path of Christendom, that would indeed have been simple. It is always simple to fall. There are an infinity of angles at which one falls, only one at which one stands. To have fallen into any one of the fads, from Gnosticism to Christian Science, would indeed have been obvious and tame. But to have avoided them all has been one whirling adventure. And in my vision, the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresies sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect. And so in our time, there are so many pitfalls that the church has to avoid falling into, right? Including certainly pitfalls of modernism and pitfalls of just acquiescing to the world, pitfalls of wanting to just be sort of tame, wanting to fit in, but also then the pitfalls of antiquarianism, of trying to go back to something that we don't even remember, and trying to recover a tradition that hasn't been traditioned. It hasn't been handed on, and so to be engaging in it without a real awareness of the whole of the church, right, is going to bring it out of context. And that the need to have this balance, to be engaged in the tremendous and profound goods that we find that may seem opposed to each other at times, and to keep going forward, recognizing that what is true and good and beautiful, and that has continued to carry the church down through the ages. All right. We are at the end. So a question, you mentioned swerving toward Orientalism. What is that in reference to? So one of his concerns with Eastern thought, and it is a concern with Eastern thought, is the tendency towards the tendency towards a depersonalization, the tendency towards the idea that everything is divine, right? That we and we are divine, and we are one of the common phrases in some of that Eastern philosophical thought, right? That we are like a drop into the ocean, right? That desire to return into the nothingness. That's something that he's going to be talking more about as we go into some of these chapters, right? That going into sort of nothingness, this losing one's self in that. These are the kinds of things that he's really concerned with. Any other questions? There we go. One. Someone's asking if I can briefly describe the differences between the Catholic Church in G.K. Chesterton's time and ours. I think one of the things that's very interesting for Chesterton's time is particularly the church in England, and that's obviously that's what's going to be influencing Chesterton the most. But it's a particularly interesting time for the church in England. And you think about some of the fantastic authors. So Chesterton, Ronald Knox, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, though he's not Catholic, is kind of part of this movement, right? But there's this beautiful resurgence that's happening in England. It starts with the Oxford movement that starts getting back into the traditions of Christianity, right? And this is in the 19th century. Starts getting back into these traditions, getting back into the fathers of the church, really sort of recovering some of this stuff. And so we move from this very sort of low, very Protestant Anglicanism to there's this move towards very high Anglicanism, to what people will call Anglo-Catholic, where they're still not united to the church in Rome, but they basically believe everything that Catholics believe. And then that sort of hits its pinnacle with St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, right? Who is part of that movement and then has read enough of the fathers of the church to realize, no, really, I need to become Catholic. And he becomes Catholic, and he writes against all of his own writings. Right? So he writes corrections to his own writings. He becomes a priest. He becomes a cardinal. And there's this tremendous conversion to the Catholic Church that's going on in England. And there's a lot of other name that comes to mind, Frank Sheed, whose writings I would strongly recommend, right? But there's there's all of this energy around the Catholic Church in England, late 19th century into the early 20th century, and that's something that hasn't happened since the Reformation, right? So it's new, it's exciting, and it's pretty awesome, and some great stuff comes out of that. Because of that, right? John Henry Cardinal Newman goes to the First Vatican Council, right? So he's there at the First Vatican Council, and he is one of two voices that actually speaks against declaring the dogma of papal infallibility. Not because he didn't agree with it. He did. He believed it. But he was looking at what was going on in England and saying, if we declare this doctrine now, it might really upset the tremendous conversion that's going on there. And we don't, so he was concerned that it would send the wrong message, right, in terms of the conversion that was going on in England. So England was going through something special at the time. And Chesterton benefits from that. He gets to become a part of it. And there's something really exciting that he's doing and he's being a part of, right? To mention, right, all of this is before the Second Vatican Council, right? And all of this excitement, all of this thrill, right? And this draw to the Catholic Church, it is a draw to the old liturgy, right? And that is where they are finding themselves rooted and in prayer. And that's something I think we need to come to terms with in our day and age as well. We're too quick to be dismissive of some of that stuff, and to think that the old must have been bad. And there's something fantastic going on in Chesterton's time that where the church is still very different than it is in our time. So, with that, we'll bring it to a close. The Eternal Revolution. So that'll be fun next week, and looking forward to it. So, why don't we close with some prayer? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, help us to recognize the profound and the tremendous balance that you have given us in the church as you seek to help lead us through the profound and tremendous reality you have created to the eternal life with you. May we maintain that balance of the extremes, and so let all of the good flourish in this world, that we might enjoy it even more fully in that eternal life with you. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Have a good night, everyone, and we'll be seeing you next week.